Margaret Thompson sat by her kitchen window, watching the rain fall on the street below. She was 67 years old and had lived in this same apartment for 15 long years. The small two-bedroom place was not fancy, but it was home. Every corner held memories of the life she had built with her husband Robert. The apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building. It had high ceilings and big windows that let in lots of light during the day. Margaret loved how the morning sun came through her bedroom window and woke her up gently. The wooden floors creaked when she walked, but she did not mind. The sound was familiar and comforting. Margaret kept her home very clean and tidy. She had the same routine every day. She would wake up at 7 in the morning, make her coffee, and sit by the kitchen window to watch the world wake up. She would see Mr. Chen from the corner store opening his shop. She would wave to Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived across the street, when she walked her little dog. These small moments made her feel connected to her neighborhood. 2 years ago, everything changed. Robert, her husband of 42 years, died suddenly from a heart attack. Margaret remembered that terrible day like it happened yesterday. She was making his favorite soup when he called out from the living room. By the time she reached him, he was gone. The doctors said it was quick and he did not suffer, but that did not make the pain any less. After Robert died, Margaret felt lost and alone. They had done everything together. He had handled all the money matters while she took care of the home. Robert had a good job at the post office for 30 years before he retired. Together, they had saved some money, but it was not much. They had planned to live simply on his pension and Social Security when they got older. Now Margaret lived alone on a small pension and Social Security payments. The money was not very much. After paying rent, utilities, and buying food, she had very little left over. Some months were harder than others. When the heating bill was high in winter or when she needed to buy medicine, money became very tight. Margaret had never been late with her rent payment in 15 years. She was proud of this fact. Mr. Russo, her landlord, had always said she was one of his best tenants. She never caused trouble, never complained, and always kept her apartment in perfect condition. She thought this good relationship would help her if she ever had problems. Vincent Russo owned many buildings in the city. He was a successful man in his 50s who wore expensive suits and drove a fancy car. Margaret had only met him a few times over the years. He would come to collect rent or check on the building. He was always polite but never friendly. He treated his tenants like business, not like people. Margaret did not know much about Mr. Russo's life. She knew he was married and had children, but she had never seen them. She knew he owned many properties because he had told her once that he was very busy managing them all. She could tell from his clothes and car that he had much more money than she did. The trouble started 6 months after Robert died. Margaret had to go to the hospital for some tests. The doctors were worried about her heart. The stress of losing Robert and living alone had made her sick. The hospital bills were very expensive. Even with Medicare, she had to pay hundreds of dollars that she did not have. For the first time in 15 years, Margaret was late with her rent. She called Mr. Russo to explain what happened. She told him about the hospital bills and asked if she could pay the rent a week late. Mr. Russo sounded annoyed on the phone. He said okay this time, but warned her it could not happen again. Margaret felt embarrassed and worried. She had always been responsible with money. She did not like asking for favors or making excuses. She promised herself it would not happen again. She even wrote Mr. Russo a letter thanking him for understanding and promising to be on time from now on. But 2 months later, Margaret had another problem. She fell in her bathroom and hurt her back badly. She had to go to the emergency room in an ambulance. The bill for the ambulance ride alone was over $800. Margaret cried when she saw the bill. She did not have that kind of money. Again, Margaret had to call Mr. Russo. This time he sounded very angry. He told her that good tenants pay their rent on time. He said he was running a business, not a charity. Margaret felt ashamed and scared. She explained about her fall and the medical bills, but Mr. Russo did not seem to care. Margaret managed to pay the late rent by borrowing money from her small savings account. This was the money she and Robert had saved for emergencies. She hated to use it, but she had no choice. She promised Mr. Russo again that it would not happen anymore. Margaret tried very hard to make her money last each month. She started buying cheaper food and turned down her heat to save money. She stopped going to the senior center because the bus fare cost too much. She became more isolated and lonely, but she was determined to pay her rent on time. The neighborhood around Margaret's apartment was changing. She noticed new coffee shops and restaurants opening. Young people in expensive clothes were walking around looking at apartments. Margaret heard other tenants talking about rent increases in nearby buildings. Some of her neighbors had already moved away because they could not afford the higher rent. Margaret did not understand what was happening to her neighborhood. She had lived there for so long and loved the community feeling. She knew all the shop owners and many of her neighbors. The old grocery store where she had shopped for years closed down and was replaced by an expensive market where everything cost twice as much. One day, Margaret saw Mr. Russo walking around outside her building with two men in suits. They were pointing at the building and talking about something. Margaret watched from her window as they looked at papers and nodded their heads. She had a bad feeling about what they might be planning. Margaret's adult children lived far away. Her daughter Sarah lived in California with her family, and her son David was in Florida. They called her sometimes and sent cards on holidays, but they had their own busy lives. Margaret did not want to worry them with her money problems. She was used to taking care of herself. That night, Margaret sat in Robert's old chair and looked at their wedding photo on the side table. She missed him so much. He would have known what to do about the money problems. He was always good at fixing things and finding solutions. Margaret felt scared and alone, but she hoped that things would get better soon. She had no idea that her troubles were just beginning. Vincent Russo sat in his large office on the 20th floor of a downtown building. Through his big windows, he could see the whole city spread out below him. His office was filled with expensive furniture and awards from real estate organizations. On his desk were photos of his wife and two teenage children, but he barely looked at them anymore. He was too busy thinking about money. Vincent had started with just one small apartment building 20 years ago. He worked hard and saved every penny to buy more properties. Now he owned 37 buildings across the city. Most people thought he was very successful, and he was. But Vincent always wanted more. He was never satisfied with what he had. That morning, Vincent received a phone call that would change everything. The caller was Tom Bradley, a city planner who worked for the government. Tom and Vincent had known each other for many years. Sometimes Tom would give Vincent information about city plans before other people knew about them. This information helped Vincent make smart business decisions. Tom told Vincent exciting news. The city was planning to change the zoning laws in several neighborhoods. This meant that areas where only small apartment buildings were allowed would soon allow big luxury condominiums. Vincent's heart started beating faster as Tom mentioned the specific streets that would be affected. One of those streets was where Margaret Thompson lived. Vincent owned 3 buildings on that street, including Margaret's building. He had bought these buildings 10 years ago when the neighborhood was not very nice. Back then, the buildings were cheap because not many people wanted to live there. Now the area was becoming popular with young professionals who had good jobs and lots of money. After the phone call, Vincent immediately called his assistant and told her to cancel all his meetings for the day. He needed to drive around and look at his properties in the area that would be rezoned. He got in his expensive black car and drove through the neighborhood, seeing them with new eyes. Vincent parked outside Margaret's building and studied it carefully. The building was old but solid. It had good bones, as real estate people like to say. With some renovation, it could be turned into luxury condos that would sell for 3 or 4 times what he could get for rent. He started doing math in his head, and the numbers made him smile. The building had 8 apartments. Right now, Vincent collected about $4,000 per month in total rent from all the tenants. But if he converted the building into luxury condos, he could sell each unit for at least $200,000. That would mean over $1.5 million from just one building. The idea made Vincent very excited, but there was a problem. Most of his tenants had lived in the building for many years. They had rent control, which meant Vincent could only raise their rent by a small amount each year. These old tenants were paying much less than what new tenants would pay. To make his plan work, Vincent needed to get rid of all the old tenants and find a way to start fresh. Vincent knew that evicting good tenants was not easy. He needed legal reasons to make them leave. He could not just tell them to go because he wanted to make more money. He started thinking about each tenant and whether any of them had given him reasons to evict them. Most of his tenants were perfect. They paid on time, kept their apartments clean, and never caused trouble. But then Vincent remembered Margaret Thompson. She had been late with her rent twice in the past few months. Vincent had been annoyed but not too worried about it at the time. Now he saw these late payments as an opportunity. Vincent drove back to his office and asked his assistant to pull out all the files for the building where Margaret lived. He wanted to review every detail of every lease and every rent payment. He was looking for any small violations or problems that he could use to justify evictions. Margaret's file showed that she had been a perfect tenant for almost 15 years. Never late, never complained, never caused any damage. But in the past 6 months, there were 2 late payments. Vincent read the notes from their phone conversations. Margaret had explained about medical bills and emergencies, but Vincent no longer cared about her excuses. Vincent called his lawyer, a tough man named Mr. Peterson who specialized in helping landlords get rid of unwanted tenants. Mr. Peterson had helped Vincent before with difficult situations. Vincent explained his plan to convert the building and asked what he could do about the current tenants. Mr. Peterson reviewed Margaret's file and smiled. He told Vincent that 2 late payments in 6 months could be considered a pattern of chronic late payment. This could be grounds for eviction, especially if Vincent could document any other small lease violations. Mr. Peterson suggested that Vincent start keeping very detailed records of every interaction with Margaret. Vincent felt excited but also a little guilty. Margaret seemed like a nice old lady who was just having some bad luck. But Vincent pushed these feelings away. Business was business, he told himself. He had worked hard to build his real estate empire, and he deserved to make as much money as possible. If Margaret could not afford to live in his building anymore, that was not his problem. Over the next few weeks, Vincent started visiting Margaret's building more often. He would walk around looking for any problems he could blame on the tenants. He checked for small violations like items in hallways or improper use of storage areas. He was building a case against his tenants, especially Margaret. Vincent also started researching the other buildings he owned in the area that would be rezoned. He calculated that he could make millions of dollars if he could convert all of them to luxury housing. The more he thought about the money, the more determined he became to clear out his current tenants. Vincent's wife noticed that he was working even longer hours than usual. She asked him what was keeping him so busy, but Vincent did not tell her about his plans. He knew she might not approve of evicting elderly tenants like Margaret. His wife had a soft heart and often donated money to charities. She would not understand that business required tough decisions. Vincent started having dreams about the luxury condos he would build. He imagined young couples with good jobs buying the apartments and paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars. He thought about the respect he would get from other real estate developers when they saw how smart he had been to buy buildings in this area before it became expensive. The city planning office sent out official notices about the zoning changes, but they used complicated legal language that most people did not understand. The notices were posted in small print in the newspaper and on community bulletin boards, but many residents did not see them or realize what they meant. Vincent was one of the few people who truly understood how much money could be made from these changes. Vincent decided that Margaret would be his first target. She was elderly and seemed vulnerable. He thought she would be easier to intimidate than some of his other tenants. Once he successfully evicted Margaret, he could use the same tactics on the other tenants in the building. Vincent called Mr. Peterson again and told him to start preparing eviction papers for Margaret Thompson. He wanted everything to be ready so he could act quickly if Margaret was late with rent again. Vincent felt powerful and smart. He was sure that his plan would work perfectly, and that he would soon be much richer than he already was. The morning of February 15th was very cold. Snow had fallen during the night, and the sidewalks were slippery with ice. Margaret woke up early as she always did, but something felt different. She had been having trouble sleeping for weeks. Every night she worried about money and wondered if she would be able to keep paying her rent. Margaret made her coffee and sat by the kitchen window to watch the snow fall. She loved winter mornings when everything looked clean and peaceful under the white snow. The street was quiet except for a few people walking carefully on the icy sidewalks. Margaret felt calm for a few minutes as she sipped her coffee and watched the world outside. At 8:30, Margaret heard footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. This was unusual because most of her neighbors had already left for work. She heard someone walking up and down the hall, stopping at different doors. Margaret was curious but did not think much about it. Sometimes repair people or delivery workers came to the building. An hour later, Margaret decided to go to the grocery store. She needed to buy food for the week, and she wanted to get there before the sidewalks became too icy. Margaret put on her heavy winter coat and her warm boots. She picked up her purse and opened the front door of her apartment. There, taped to her door, was a white envelope with her name written on it in black ink. Margaret's heart started beating fast. She had a terrible feeling about what might be inside the envelope. With shaking hands, she pulled the tape off and opened it. The paper inside had big black letters at the top that said, "Notice to quit and vacate." Margaret had to read the words 3 times before she understood what they meant. It was an eviction notice. Mr. Russo was telling her that she had to move out of her apartment within 30 days. Margaret felt dizzy and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling down. She read the notice again, hoping she had made a mistake. But the words were very clear. The notice said she was being evicted for chronic late payment of rent and violation of lease terms. It was signed by Vincent Russo and dated that morning. Margaret went back inside her apartment and sat down at her kitchen table. She read the eviction notice over and over, trying to understand what had happened. Yes, she had been late with rent twice in the past few months, but she had paid everything she owed. She had even called Mr. Russo to explain about her medical bills. She thought he had understood her situation. The notice listed several complaints against Margaret. It said she had been late with rent multiple times, though Margaret knew this was not true. It said she had damaged the apartment, which was completely false. Margaret kept her home very clean and had never broken or damaged anything. The notice also said she had disturbed other tenants, but Margaret was one of the quietest people in the building. Margaret felt confused and scared. She did not understand why Mr. Russo was lying about her. She had always been a good tenant. She had lived in the apartment for 15 years without any problems. Why was this happening now, when she was already struggling with money and health problems? With trembling fingers, Margaret dialed Mr. Russo's phone number. Her heart was pounding as she waited for him to answer. When he picked up the phone, his voice sounded cold and unfriendly. Margaret had never heard him sound like this before. "Mr. Russo, this is Margaret Thompson from apartment 2B, she said in a shaky voice. "I found an eviction notice on my door this morning. I think there must be some mistake." "There is no mistake, Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Russo replied. His voice was hard and without any kindness. "You have been a problem tenant for months now. I cannot continue to deal with late payments and lease violations." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "But Mr. Russo, I was only late twice and both times I explained why. I had medical emergencies. I paid everything I owed, plus the late fees. I have been a good tenant for 15 years. The decision is final," Mr. Russo said. "You have 30 days to vacate the apartment. I suggest you start looking for somewhere else to live." Margaret's voice became desperate. "Please, Mr. Russo, I'm an old woman. My husband died, and I am trying my best to manage on my own. I promise I will never be late again. I will do anything to make this right. This apartment is my home." "I am not running a charity, Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Russo said coldly. "I need tenants who can pay their rent on time every month. If you cannot afford to live here anymore, that is not my problem." "You have 30 days, but where will I go?" Margaret asked, crying now. "I do not have money to move. All my friends and doctors are in this neighborhood. I have lived here for 15 years. Please, I am begging you to reconsider." Mr. Russo's voice became even harder. "I have made my decision. Do not call me again about this matter. If you do not move out in 30 days, I will have the sheriff remove you and your belongings." The phone line went dead. Mr. Russo had hung up on her. Margaret sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, unable to believe what had just happened. The man who had been her landlord for 15 years had just thrown her out of her home without any mercy or understanding. Margaret called her daughter Sarah in California. Sarah was at work and could only talk for a few minutes. When Margaret explained about the eviction notice, Sarah was shocked and angry. She said she would try to help, but she had her own family and mortgage to worry about. Sarah lived far away and did not have extra money to help her mother move or find a new place. Next, Margaret called her son David in Florida. David listened to the whole story and was very upset. He said Mr. Russo was being unfair and cruel. But David had just lost his job the month before and was looking for work. He could not afford to help his mother financially, and he could not take time off to come help her move. Margaret felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Even when Robert died, she had not felt this hopeless. At least then she had still had her home and her neighborhood. Now she was losing everything that connected her to her old life. Margaret spent the rest of the day calling other apartments in the area. Every place she called was too expensive. The rent for even the smallest studio apartment was more than she received each month from Social Security and her pension. The few places she could afford were in dangerous neighborhoods far from her doctors and the places she knew. That evening, Margaret sat in Robert's old chair and cried. She looked around the apartment that had been her home for so long. Every room had memories of the life she and Robert had built together. The kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals. The living room where they had watched television together every evening. The bedroom where Robert had died in his sleep. Margaret realized that Mr. Russo did not care about her 15 years of perfect tenancy. He did not care that she was an elderly widow with health problems. He did not care that evicting her would destroy her life. All he cared about was money. Margaret picked up the eviction notice and read it one more time. 30 days. In 30 days, she would have to leave the only home she had known since Robert retired. She would have to leave her neighborhood, her friends, and everything familiar. At 67 years old, Margaret would have to start her life completely over, and she had no idea how she would survive. Margaret spent the next 3 weeks desperately trying to find help. She called legal aid organizations, but they were too busy with other cases and could not see her for 2 months. She went to social services, but the waiting lists for affordable housing were years long. She even went to her church and asked the pastor for advice, but he could only offer prayers and sympathy. Every day, Margaret hoped that Mr. Russo would change his mind. She wrote him letters explaining her situation and promising to be a perfect tenant. She even offered to pay him extra money each month if he would let her stay. But Mr. Russo never responded to her letters or phone calls. His assistant would only say that the eviction was final and nothing could change it. Margaret's neighbors were shocked when they heard about the eviction. Mrs. Chen from apartment 1A had lived in the building for 12 years and had never seen Mr. Russo treat anyone so badly. She started a petition asking Mr. Russo to let Margaret stay. Almost everyone in the building signed it, along with many people from the neighborhood who knew Margaret. Mr. Johnson from apartment 3C offered to talk to Mr. Russo personally. He was a retired teacher who was good with words and thought he might be able to reason with the landlord. But when Mr. Johnson called, Mr. Russo's assistant said he was too busy to meet with tenants about personal matters. The petition with 43 signatures was delivered to Mr. Russo's office. The people who delivered it were told that Mr. Russo was in meetings all day and could not be disturbed. 2 days later, Margaret received a letter from Mr. Russo's lawyer saying that any further attempts to contact Mr. Russo about the eviction would be considered harassment. As the 30-day deadline approached, Margaret realized she had no choice but to find somewhere else to live. She had found only one apartment she could afford. It was a tiny studio in a rough neighborhood on the other side of town. The building was old and dirty, and the area had problems with crime. But it was all Margaret could afford with her small income. The studio apartment cost $800 per month, which was almost all of Margaret's monthly income from Social Security and her pension. After paying rent, she would have less than $300 left for food, medicine, utilities, and everything else she needed. Margaret knew it would be very difficult, but she had no other choice. Margaret used most of her small savings account to pay the security deposit and first month's rent for the studio apartment. This was money she and Robert had saved over many years for emergencies. Margaret had hoped to never touch this money, but now she needed it just to have a place to live. On the morning of March 16th, Margaret had an appointment with her heart doctor. She had been having chest pains from all the stress of the eviction. The doctor was worried about her and wanted to do some tests. Margaret did not want to miss the appointment because she was afraid her heart problems might be getting worse. Margaret asked Mrs. Chen to watch for the moving truck while she was at the doctor's office. Margaret had hired 2 young men with a truck to move her belongings to the new apartment. They were supposed to come at noon, and Margaret expected to be back from her appointment by 11:30. But the doctor's office was running very late that day. Margaret waited for over an hour before she was called in to see the doctor. Then the doctor wanted to do several tests that took more time. Margaret kept looking at the clock and worrying about getting home, but she did not want to leave before the doctor was finished examining her. At 12:15, Margaret's cell phone rang. It was Mrs. Chen, and she sounded very upset. She told Margaret that Mr. Russo had arrived with a big truck and several workers. They were taking all of Margaret's belongings out of the apartment and putting them on the sidewalk. Mrs. Chen said she had tried to stop them, but Mr. Russo had legal papers that said he could remove everything. Margaret felt like she was having a heart attack. She told the doctor she had to leave immediately. The doctor was worried about her condition and wanted her to stay for more tests, but Margaret could not wait. She took a taxi home as fast as she could, but by the time she arrived, it was too late. All of Margaret's possessions were piled on the sidewalk in front of the building. Her furniture, clothes, dishes, and personal belongings were mixed together in a big mess. Some items had been damaged when the workers threw them out of the apartment. Margaret's kitchen table had a broken leg, and several boxes of dishes had been dropped and broken. The worst damage was to Margaret's most precious possessions. A box of family photos, including her wedding pictures and photos of Robert, had been torn open, and the pictures were scattered on the wet sidewalk. Many of the photos were ruined by the melting snow and dirty water. Margaret fell to her knees and tried to gather up the damaged pictures, crying as she held the ruined memories of her life with Robert. Mr. Russo stood nearby, watching Margaret cry over her damaged belongings. He showed no emotion at all. When Margaret looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, he simply said, "You had 30 days to move out voluntarily. This is what happens when tenants do not follow eviction orders." Margaret's neighbors came out to help her. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Johnson, and several other people from the building tried to save what they could of Margaret's belongings. They covered her furniture with plastic sheets and helped her sort through the scattered items. But much of what Margaret owned was already damaged by the weather and rough handling. The young men Margaret had hired to move her belongings arrived just as Mr. Russo's crew was finishing. They were shocked to see everything already on the sidewalk. Margaret had to pay them anyway, even though they now had to load wet and damaged items instead of carefully packing everything from inside the apartment. Margaret rode in the moving truck to her new studio apartment, surrounded by her damaged possessions. She looked back at the building where she had lived for 15 years and saw Mr. Russo talking on his phone. He was probably already making plans to renovate her apartment and rent it for much more money. The studio apartment was even worse than Margaret remembered. It was very small, dirty, and smelled bad. The windows were small and did not let in much light. There was barely enough room for Margaret's bed and a few pieces of furniture. Most of her belongings had to be put in storage because there was no space for them. That first night in the studio apartment, Margaret sat on her bed and looked through the damaged photos she had managed to save. Many of her favorite pictures of Robert were ruined, but she had saved some. She held a picture of their wedding day and remembered how happy and hopeful they had been 42 years ago. They had never imagined that Margaret would end up alone in a place like this. Margaret could hear loud music and arguing from the apartment next door. The building was not safe or quiet like her old home. She felt scared and alone in this strange place, surrounded by strangers who did not care about her. Meanwhile, Mr. Russo went home to his large house in the suburbs. He had dinner with his family and told his wife that he had successfully removed a problem tenant from one of his buildings. He did not mention that the tenant was a 67-year-old widow with health problems. He did not mention the damaged photos or Margaret's tears. He only talked about how the apartment could now be renovated and rented for 3 times as much money. The next day, Mr. Russo posted an advertisement online for Margaret's old apartment. The ad described it as a newly available luxury unit in an up-and-coming neighborhood and listed the rent at $1,200 per month, exactly 3 times what Margaret had been paying. Within a week, Mr. Russo had found new tenants, a young couple who both had good jobs and could easily afford the higher rent. Margaret's new life in the studio apartment was much harder than she had expected. The building was in a neighborhood that was not safe, especially for an elderly woman living alone. At night, she could hear people fighting in the streets and police sirens almost every evening. Margaret was afraid to go outside after dark, which made her feel even more isolated and trapped. The studio apartment was so small that Margaret could barely move around. Her bed took up most of the space, and she had room for only 1 chair and a small table. Most of her furniture and belongings were in a storage unit across town that cost her $50 every month. This was money she could not afford to spend, but she had nowhere else to put her things. Every morning, Margaret woke up feeling sad and confused. For a few seconds, she would forget where she was and expect to see the familiar walls of her old bedroom. Then reality would hit her, and she would remember that she was no longer in the home she had shared with Robert for so many years. The stress of the move and the shock of losing her home began to affect Margaret's health very badly. The chest pains she had been having became worse and more frequent. She had trouble sleeping because of the noise from other apartments and the stress of worrying about money. Margaret lost weight because she could not afford to buy as much food as before. 2 weeks after moving to the studio, Margaret had to go to the emergency room because she thought she was having a heart attack. The doctor said it was a panic attack caused by stress, but they wanted to run more tests to make sure her heart was okay. Margaret spent 6 hours in the emergency room, and the bill was over $2,000. Margaret looked at the hospital bill and started crying. Even with Medicare, she owed $1,500 that she did not have. This was more money than she received in 2 months from Social Security. Margaret did not know how she would ever pay such a large bill. She called the hospital billing office and asked if she could make small payments, but they wanted at least $100 per month. Margaret's old doctor was too far away from her new apartment, so she had to find a new doctor. The only doctor who would take new Medicare patients was in a clinic that was always very busy. Margaret had to wait hours every time she had an appointment, and the doctors seemed rushed and did not spend much time with her. Margaret's prescription medicines cost more than she expected. The pharmacy near her old apartment had given her a discount because she had been a customer for many years. The new pharmacy did not offer any discounts, and Margaret's medicines cost almost $200 per month. This was money she could not afford, but she needed the medicines for her heart and blood pressure. Margaret tried to save money by eating less food. She would buy the cheapest items at the grocery store and make them last as long as possible. She often had only soup and crackers for dinner because that was all she could afford. Margaret lost 15 pounds in 2 months, and she looked thin and weak. The isolation was almost as bad as the money problems. Margaret's old neighborhood had been like a small community where everyone knew each other. She had been friends with the shop owners and many of her neighbors. In the new neighborhood, nobody talked to each other. Margaret felt like she was invisible. Margaret could not afford to take the bus to visit her old neighborhood very often. When she did go back, she felt sad seeing how the area was changing. Several of her favorite shops had closed, and new expensive restaurants had opened that she could not afford. Even Mr. Chen's corner store had been sold to new owners who did not remember her. Margaret's daughter Sarah called every week to check on her, but Sarah lived far away and had her own family problems. Sarah's husband had been laid off from his job, and they were struggling to pay their own bills. Sarah felt guilty that she could not help her mother, but she simply did not have extra money. Margaret's son David was still looking for work after losing his job. He applied for jobs every day but had not found anything yet. David wanted to help his mother, but he was having trouble paying his own rent. He felt terrible that his mother was suffering while he could not do anything to help her. Margaret started having nightmares about becoming homeless. She would dream that she could not pay the rent for the studio apartment and was forced to live on the streets. Margaret would wake up in a cold sweat, terrified that her nightmares might come true. She had never imagined that she would be so poor and vulnerable at her age. The worst part was that Margaret felt ashamed of her situation. She had always been proud and independent. She and Robert had worked hard all their lives and had never asked anyone for charity. Now Margaret felt like a burden and a failure. She was embarrassed when she had to ask for help or admit that she could not afford things. Margaret tried to find part-time work to earn extra money, but no one wanted to hire a 67-year-old woman with health problems. The few jobs available for seniors paid very little and required standing for long hours, which Margaret could not do because of her back problems from the fall she had taken months earlier. Margaret applied for food stamps and other government assistance programs, but the paperwork was confusing and the waiting lists were long. She spent hours sitting in government offices, only to be told that she needed more documents or that she did not qualify for certain programs. The process was humiliating and exhausting. 3 months after the eviction, Margaret received a letter from a collection agency about the unpaid hospital bill. The letter threatened to garnish her Social Security payments if she did not pay immediately. Margaret was terrified because Social Security was her only source of income. If they took money from her Social Security, she would not be able to pay rent or buy food. Margaret called the collection agency and tried to explain her situation, but they were not interested in her story. They told her she had to pay $500 immediately, or they would start legal action. Margaret did not have $500, and she did not know where she could get that much money. That night, Margaret sat in her small apartment and thought about how different her life had become. 6 months ago, she had been living peacefully in her comfortable home, surrounded by familiar things and friendly neighbors. Now she was struggling to survive in a place that did not feel like home, worried constantly about money, and afraid of what would happen to her next. Margaret looked at one of the few photos of Robert that had not been damaged during the eviction. She talked to the picture as if Robert could hear her. She told him how scared and alone she felt, and how much she missed the life they had built together. Margaret wondered what Robert would think of Mr. Russo and the cruel way he had treated her. Meanwhile, Vincent Russo was celebrating his success. Margaret's old apartment had been renovated with new floors and modern appliances. The young couple who rented it were paying $1,200 per month, which was $800 more than Margaret had paid. Vincent was very pleased with how his plan was working out. 6 months after Margaret's eviction, Vincent Russo felt like the smartest businessman in the city. He had successfully converted Margaret's building and 2 others into luxury apartments. The young professionals who moved in were paying 3 times more rent than his old tenants. Vincent calculated that he was making an extra $15,000 per month from just those 3 buildings. Vincent used this extra money to start his biggest project yet. He had bought a large piece of land on the edge of downtown, where he planned to build a luxury apartment complex with 50 units. Vincent borrowed millions of dollars from 3 different banks to pay for the construction. He was confident that he could sell or rent the apartments for high prices and make huge profits. Vincent hired a construction company that promised to build the apartments quickly and cheaply. The company was owned by Vincent's brother-in-law, Tony, who said he could save Vincent money by using less expensive materials and cutting some corners on safety features that nobody would notice. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for Vincent. His other rental properties were making more money than ever because the whole city was becoming more expensive. Vincent bought a bigger house for his family and a new sports car for himself. He joined an expensive country club and started wearing even more costly suits. But Vincent's success was about to change very quickly. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in September. Vincent was having breakfast at his country club when his phone rang. It was the city's building inspector, and he sounded very serious. The inspector told Vincent that there had been a complaint about the construction at his new apartment complex. Someone had reported that the builders were not following safety codes and were using materials that were not approved by the city. The inspector said he was coming to examine the construction site that afternoon. Vincent felt nervous, but he told himself that everything would be fine. Tony had assured him that all the work was being done properly. Vincent called Tony to warn him about the inspection, and Tony said he would make sure everything looked good when the inspector arrived. But when the inspector examined the construction site, he found many serious problems. The electrical wiring was not installed correctly and could cause fires. The plumbing did not meet city standards and could leak or break. Worst of all, the foundation was not strong enough to support the weight of the building safely. The inspector immediately ordered all construction to stop. He said the building was dangerous and could collapse if work continued. Vincent would have to tear down everything that had been built so far and start over with proper materials and techniques. This would cost Vincent hundreds of thousands of dollars that he did not have. Vincent was furious with Tony for doing such poor work, but Tony said it was not his fault. He claimed that Vincent had pressured him to work as cheaply as possible, and this was the only way to stay within the budget. Tony and Vincent had a huge fight, and their family relationship was destroyed. While Vincent was dealing with the construction problems, more trouble was coming from another direction. Several of his former tenants had been talking to each other and to a lawyer who specialized in helping people who had been treated unfairly by landlords. Mrs. Chen, from Margaret's old building, had kept in touch with Margaret and knew how badly she was struggling in her new living situation. Mrs. Chen was angry about what had happened to Margaret and started asking other former tenants about their experiences. With Vincent Russo, Mrs. Chen discovered that Vincent had evicted 6 other elderly tenants from his buildings in the past year. All of them had been long-term tenants who were paying low rent, because of rent control laws. All of them had been evicted for small reasons that seemed unfair. All of them had been replaced by younger tenants who paid much higher rent. The lawyer, Ms. Patricia Martinez, was very interested in these stories. She had seen other cases where landlords deliberately evicted elderly tenants to make more money. Ms. Martinez offered to represent all of the evicted tenants in a class action lawsuit against Vincent Russo. Ms. Martinez filed the lawsuit in October, claiming that Vincent had systematically harassed and illegally evicted elderly tenants so he could raise rents. The lawsuit asked for money to compensate the tenants for their suffering and to punish Vincent for his illegal actions. When the local newspaper heard about the lawsuit, they decided to write a story about it. The reporter interviewed Margaret and several other evicted tenants. Margaret told the reporter about how Vincent had thrown her belongings onto the sidewalk and damaged her. Precious photos of Robert. The newspaper story was published on the front page with the headline, "Greedy Landlord Targets Elderly Tenants." The article included a photo of Margaret looking sad and frail in her tiny studio apartment. It also included a photo of Vincent getting into his expensive sports car outside his luxury office building. The contrast between Margaret's suffering and Vincent's wealth made many people in the city very angry. The newspaper received dozens of letters from readers who were outraged by Vincent's treatment of elderly tenants. Some people started calling Vincent's office to complain about his business practices. The local television news stations picked up the story and interviewed Margaret on camera. Margaret was nervous about being on television, but she wanted people to know what Vincent had done to her and the other elderly tenants. Margaret's interview was very emotional, and many viewers felt sorry for her. Vincent watched the news story about himself and was shocked to see how bad he looked. The reporter made him sound like a cruel man who enjoyed hurting old people. Vincent had never thought of himself that way. He had just been trying to make money, which he believed was normal business behavior. Vincent's wife was very upset when she saw the news story. She had not known the details about how Vincent had evicted Margaret and the other elderly tenants. Vincent's wife thought what he had done was terrible and cruel. She was embarrassed that her friends and neighbors now knew that her husband was the greedy landlord everyone was talking about. Vincent's teenage children were also embarrassed by the negative publicity. Their friends at school had seen the news stories and were asking uncomfortable questions about their father's business. Vincent's son was particularly upset because he had always been proud of his father's success. The bad publicity began to hurt Vincent's business in other ways. Some of his current tenants started looking for new apartments because they did not want to rent from someone with such a bad reputation. Several business associates stopped working with Vincent because they did not want to be associated with the negative news stories. Vincent hired an expensive public relations company to try to improve his reputation, but the damage was already done. Every time the public relations company tried to tell Vincent's side of the story, people remembered the image of Margaret sitting sadly in her tiny apartment, surrounded by her damaged belongings. The class action lawsuit was moving forward, and Ms. Martinez was discovering more evidence of Vincent's questionable business practices. She found documents showing that Vincent had deliberately targeted elderly tenants for eviction and had lied about lease violations to justify removing them from their homes. Vincent's lawyer told him that the lawsuit was very serious and that he could be ordered to pay millions of dollars in damages to the tenants he had evicted. The lawyer also warned Vincent that the city government was now investigating his business practices and could revoke his licenses to operate rental properties. For the first time since he had started his real estate business, Vincent felt scared and uncertain about the future. The construction disaster and the lawsuit were costing him enormous amounts of money. The negative publicity was destroying his reputation and making it harder to do business. Vincent began to realize that his treatment of Margaret and the other elderly tenants had been the beginning of his downfall, but it was too late to undo the damage he had caused, and his problems were only going to get worse. Vincent's troubles grew worse much faster than he had expected. The class action lawsuit that Ms. Martinez had filed against him was attracting more attention from government officials who were supposed to protect tenants from bad landlords. The city's housing department started investigating all of Vincent's properties to see if he had broken other laws. The housing inspectors found many violations in Vincent's buildings. Some apartments had broken heating systems that Vincent had not fixed. Other apartments had leaking roofs or plumbing problems that Vincent had ignored for months. The inspectors also found that Vincent had been charging illegal fees to some tenants and had not returned security deposits when tenants moved out. The city ordered Vincent to fix all the problems immediately and fined him $50,000 for the violations. Vincent had to hire contractors to make emergency repairs in dozens of apartments, which cost him much more money than if he had maintained the buildings properly from the beginning. While Vincent was dealing with the city violations, the banks that had loaned him money for the failed construction project were becoming very worried. The banks had expected Vincent to start making payments on the loans by now, but the stopped construction meant there was no income from the project. The banks wanted their money back immediately. Vincent tried to explain to the banks that the construction problems were not his fault and that he would restart the project as soon as possible. But the banks had seen the negative news stories about Vincent's business practices. They no longer trusted him to repay the loans and demanded that he pay back millions of dollars within 60 days. Vincent did not have millions of dollars in cash. Most of his money was tied up in his rental properties, which were now being investigated by the city and were losing tenants because of the bad publicity. Vincent tried to sell some of his buildings quickly to raise cash, but buyers were not interested in properties owned by someone with such a bad reputation. The few buyers who were interested in Vincent's buildings offered much less money than the properties were worth. They knew Vincent was desperate and took advantage of his situation. Vincent was forced to sell 3 of his best buildings for half of what they were really worth. But even this was not enough money to pay back the banks. Vincent's credit rating, which had always been excellent, began to fall rapidly. Credit rating companies had seen the news stories about his legal troubles and the failed construction project. They downgraded Vincent's credit score, which made it even harder for him to borrow money or do business with other companies. The banks began legal proceedings to take control of Vincent's remaining properties. This process, called foreclosure, would allow the banks to sell Vincent's buildings to recover the money he owed them. Vincent hired expensive lawyers to fight the foreclosures, but the legal fees used up even more of his remaining money. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit was moving toward a trial. Ms. Martinez had found even more evidence of Vincent's illegal eviction practices. She had discovered that Vincent had lied to city officials about the reasons for evicting tenants and had forged documents to make his evictions look legal. The judge in the case was very angry when he learned about Vincent's dishonest actions. The judge ordered Vincent to pay for the legal costs of all the tenants he had evicted, which amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The judge also said that Vincent would probably have to pay much more money in damages when the case went to trial. Vincent's insurance company refused to help him pay for the lawsuit. They said that Vincent's actions had been intentionally illegal, and insurance did not cover damages caused by deliberate criminal behavior. Vincent would have to pay all the legal costs and damages from his own money. The stress of all these problems was destroying Vincent's personal life as well as his business. Vincent's wife, Maria, had been embarrassed by the negative publicity, but now she was also worried about losing their house and their comfortable lifestyle. Maria started having arguments with Vincent about money and about the cruel way he had treated his elderly tenants. Maria told Vincent that she was ashamed of what he had done to Margaret and the other elderly people. She said that Vincent had become greedy and heartless, and that she did not like the man he had become. Maria began sleeping in the guest bedroom and talking to a divorce lawyer about ending their marriage. Vincent's teenage children were also affected by their father's troubles. Vincent's son was angry and embarrassed that his friends at school knew about the news stories. Vincent's daughter was upset that her family might have to move out of their nice house and change to a less expensive school. Vincent tried to explain to his children that he had just been trying to make money for the family, but they did not understand why he had to hurt elderly people to do it. Vincent's children began to lose respect for their father and started avoiding him when they were at home. The negative publicity continued to grow worse. More news stories were written about Vincent's legal troubles and financial problems. Local television stations interviewed other landlords who said that Vincent's actions were giving all landlords a bad reputation. Even people in the real estate business began to distance themselves from Vincent. Vincent's membership at the expensive country club was quietly canceled. The club's board of directors said that Vincent's negative publicity was bad for the club's reputation. Vincent was asked to return his membership card and not to come back to the club facilities. Vincent's few remaining business associates stopped returning his phone calls. Companies that had worked with Vincent for years suddenly found excuses not to do business with him anymore. Vincent realized that his reputation in the business community was completely destroyed. 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, Vincent received devastating news. The judge had ruled that Vincent would have to pay $3 million in damages to the elderly tenants he had evicted. This was money that Vincent absolutely did not have, especially with all his other financial problems. Ms. Martinez held a press conference to announce the court victory. She stood next to Margaret and the other elderly tenants who had been evicted by Vincent. Margaret looked healthier than she had in months because she knew that Vincent would finally be punished for what he had done to her. Vincent's lawyer told him that he should declare bankruptcy, which would mean admitting that he could not pay his debts. Bankruptcy would allow Vincent to get rid of some of his debts, but it would also mean losing most of his remaining properties and having his financial life controlled by the court. Vincent had worked for 20 years to build his real estate empire, and now it was all falling apart in just a few months. The man who had been so proud of his wealth and success was facing the loss of everything he had worked for. Vincent finally understood that his cruel treatment of Margaret had started a chain of events that was destroying his life. But even as Vincent's world was collapsing around him, he still did not feel sorry for what he had done to Margaret and the other elderly tenants. Vincent was only sorry that he had been caught and punished. He still believed that making money was more important than treating people with kindness and respect. 2 years after evicting Margaret from her home, Vincent Russo's life had completely fallen apart. The bankruptcy court had taken away almost everything he owned. His real estate empire was gone, sold piece by piece to pay his debts. The luxury house where his family had lived was foreclosed by the bank. His expensive cars had been repossessed. Vincent had gone from being a wealthy businessman to having almost nothing. The final blow to Vincent's marriage came when Maria filed for divorce. She could not forgive Vincent for the cruel way he had treated elderly tenants, and she could not handle the shame of being married to someone everyone in the city knew as a greedy landlord. Maria took their 2 children and moved across the country to live with her sister. She changed her last name back to her maiden name so people would not know she had been married to Vincent. Vincent's children wanted nothing to do with their father. They were embarrassed by his reputation and angry that his actions had destroyed their family. Vincent's son refused to speak to him at all. Vincent's daughter would only communicate through text messages, and even those were cold and distant. Vincent had lost his family along with his money and his business. The real estate community in the city had completely rejected Vincent. No one would hire him to work for their companies. No one would do business with him. Vincent's name had become so damaged that just being associated with him could hurt other people's reputations. Vincent was essentially blacklisted from the only industry he knew how to work in. Vincent tried to find work in other fields, but it was very difficult. Every time a potential employer searched for his name on the internet, they found dozens of news stories about his cruel treatment of elderly tenants. Most companies did not want to hire someone with such a bad reputation, especially someone who was in his 50s and had no experience outside of real estate. After months of unsuccessful job searching, Vincent finally found work as a night security guard at a warehouse. The job paid minimum wage, which was barely enough money to survive. Vincent had gone from making hundreds of thousands of dollars per year to earning less than many teenagers at their first jobs. Vincent was forced to move into a small, cheap apartment in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. The building was old and poorly maintained, with broken elevators, peeling paint, and problems with heat and plumbing. Vincent's new apartment was tiny and depressing, not much bigger than the studio apartment where Margaret now lived. By a strange twist of fate, Vincent's new apartment was in the same neighborhood where Margaret had been forced to move after her eviction. The area was known for its crime problems and rundown buildings. It was the kind of place where people lived when they had no other choices, when they had fallen on hard times and could not afford anything better. Vincent's new landlord was an elderly man named Mr. Garcia who owned several small apartment buildings in the neighborhood. Mr. Garcia was a kind person who tried to help his tenants when they had problems. He understood that most of the people who lived in his buildings were struggling financially and needed patience and understanding. Mr. Garcia had become friends with many of his tenants over the years. One of his favorite tenants was a quiet elderly woman who lived in a studio apartment in one of his other buildings. She was always polite and helpful, and she had started volunteering at the local community center, where she helped other elderly people with paperwork and errands. This helpful tenant was Margaret Thompson. After receiving her share of the money from the lawsuit against Vincent, Margaret had been able to move to a slightly better apartment. She still lived in the same rough neighborhood, but her new studio was cleaner and safer. More importantly, Margaret had found purpose in helping other people who were struggling, just as she had struggled. Margaret had joined a support group for elderly people who had been evicted or mistreated by landlords. She shared her story with others and helped them find legal assistance and social services. Margaret's experience with Vincent had been terrible, but she had used it to help other people in similar situations. Margaret also volunteered at a food bank and helped deliver meals to elderly people who could not leave their homes. Despite all the hardships she had endured, Margaret had not become bitter or cruel. Instead, she had become more compassionate and understanding of other people's struggles. One day, Mr. Garcia was having coffee with Margaret at the community center where she volunteered. He mentioned that he had a new tenant who seemed very unhappy and bitter. The man was in his 50s and had recently moved into one of Mr. Garcia's apartments after losing his job and going through a divorce. Mr. Garcia said the new tenant complained constantly about everything. He complained about the noise from other apartments, about the condition of the building, and about having to live in such a poor neighborhood. The man seemed to think he was better than the other tenants and acted like his situation was temporary, as if he expected to move somewhere better very soon. He acts like he is entitled to better treatment, Mr. Garcia told Margaret. He does not seem to understand that everyone in this neighborhood is doing their best with difficult circumstances. I try to be patient with him, but he can be very unpleasant. Margaret listened thoughtfully as Mr. Garcia described his difficult tenant. Something about the story sounded familiar, but Margaret could not quite place why. She suggested that Mr. Garcia try to be understanding, because people sometimes acted badly when they were scared and had lost everything they cared about. Maybe he just needs time to adjust, Margaret said kindly. When people lose their homes and their security, they sometimes become angry and bitter, but everyone deserves a second chance to change and become a better person. Mr. Garcia was impressed by Margaret's wisdom and kindness. He knew about her own struggles with housing and how badly she had been treated by her former landlord. Yet Margaret was still willing to show compassion for someone who was being difficult and unpleasant. What Margaret did not know was that the bitter, complaining tenant Mr. Garcia was describing was Vincent Russo himself. Vincent had been so changed by his financial ruin and personal losses that Mr. Garcia did not recognize him from the old news stories. Vincent looked older and thinner, and he dressed in cheap clothes instead of expensive suits. Vincent spent his days feeling sorry for himself and blaming other people for his problems. He blamed his ex-wife for divorcing him. He blamed his lawyer for not winning his court cases. He blamed the news media for destroying his reputation. Vincent never took responsibility for his own actions or admitted that he had brought these troubles on himself by treating people cruelly. Vincent had no idea that Margaret lived in the same neighborhood. He had never bothered to learn what had happened to her after the eviction. Vincent was so focused on his own problems that he did not pay attention to the other people around him. He did not realize that some of his neighbors were people who had suffered because of his greed and heartlessness. Margaret, meanwhile, continued to live her life with grace and dignity despite her limited circumstances. She had learned to find happiness in small things, a phone call from one of her children, a good book from the library, or helping another elderly person solve a problem. Margaret had discovered that kindness and compassion brought more satisfaction than money and material possessions. The contrast between Margaret's and Vincent's responses to hardship showed the difference in their characters. Margaret had faced her troubles with courage and had used her experience to help others. Vincent had responded to his troubles with bitterness and blame, becoming an unpleasant person that others wanted to avoid. Vincent never learned that Margaret was living nearby or that she had spoken kindly about him to Mr. Garcia. He never discovered that the woman he had so cruelly evicted was quietly advocating for patience and understanding toward him. Margaret's small act of grace went unnoticed by Vincent, but it reflected the fundamental difference between them. Margaret had remained kind despite suffering, while Vincent had become cruel in pursuit of wealth and had lost everything as a result. In the end, karma had come full circle. Vincent, who had once held power over vulnerable tenants, was now a vulnerable tenant himself. Margaret, who had been powerless against Vincent's greed, had found strength in helping others and had become a respected member of her community. The cruel landlord had become exactly what he had once despised, a struggling renter with no power and no respect, dependent on the kindness of others for basic shelter and dignity.